Osio nagad gohin dauton talek Janelle dalek ayet gena digagi gaelige Michael Sarah Dundon Augilis Jagesai Francis Polson Dudon Jihadladi Tlaiko Utasa. Hi everyone, my name is Rebecca Nagel. I'm a citizen of Cherokee Nation. I live in Tahlequah, Oklahoma. I grew up in Joplin, Missouri. My parents are Michael Nagel and Sarah Thompson, and my grandmother is Frances Polson, who grew up near Jay, Oklahoma. I am a journalist, and my work usually is at the intersection of Native representation in mainstream media and policies and court cases that impact Indigenous rights. And if you want to check it out, I have written and reported and hosted 2 seasons of a podcast called This Land. The first season is about a Supreme Court case that impacted the reservation status of 5 tribes here in Eastern Oklahoma, including mine. And the second season is about an attack on a law called the Indian Child Welfare Act. So if you want to, please check that out. So today we are going to be talking about tribal sovereignty. But before we get into that, I really want to frame it with what are mainstream understandings about tribal sovereignty among the US public, and where does that come from? And so to start off with, I'm going to share this image. So this is a screen grab of CNN's coverage of election night in November 2020. And it's exit polls that they gathered in the state of Arizona. And you can see they're categorizing the exit polls by race. But instead of listing Native voters in the state of Arizona, they put a line that said something else and categorized us as something else. This problematic categorization from CNN spurred a lot of really funny moments on social media. And so we got the meme, Tim McGraw's Something Else Outlaw. We also got the meme, Something Else in the Cupboard. It's like pretty hilarious few days on Facebook and Twitter for Native folks. But it isn't a laughing matter. The mistake that CNN made is really serious, because what it did is that it erased Native voters in the state that had a lot of political power and actually swung Arizona for Biden on a night where a lot of national attention was about the outcome in Arizona. And so these 2 maps show that political power of Native voters in the state. So the map on the left is the outcome by precinct of the presidential election in Arizona. And the map on the right are tribal lands in the state. And you can see that those blue areas are basically Phoenix and tribal land. And so, on some reservations within Arizona, 95 to 98% of the vote went for Biden. And so that important political power was erased by CNN's coverage. CNN is obviously not the only outlet that does this. This is an article from the New York Times that came out in July of 2020 when people were talking about racial disparities with who was being impacted by COVID and also COVID-19 deaths. And they called, the title of the article is "The Fullest Look Yet at Racial Inequity in Coronavirus." But you'll notice from the categories of race that they analyzed, Native American people weren't really included. This is despite that COVID-19 had a really high disproportionate impact in Native communities that reflect federal policies that really need to shift. And so one report from the Washington Post found that while 1 in 1,300 white people in the United States had died of COVID, 1 in 240 Native Americans had died. And so that's a huge disparity. And so this is not just CNN or the New York Times. It's something that's actually pervasive in our culture. When you turn on the television, when you listen to the radio, when you tune into Netflix, less than 0.1% of the people that you will see and hear will be Native American. There's a really great sociologist and researcher named Dr. Stephanie Freiberg. She's Tulalip, who's put some real numbers to this. So she did a study that looked at the over 3,000 television characters on the most popular TV shows in 2 decades, from the mid 1980s to the mid 2000s. And she counted how many of them were Native American. And the grand total out of over 3,000 TV characters was just 3 Native characters. What her research also shows is that while we are most often not represented at all, when we are represented, it's not contemporary, living, breathing, real Native people. It's always this historicized and romanticized past. So another one of her studies, which she did in 2015, is she looked at the first 100 Google image search results for American Indian and Native American, and found that 95% of the results, so 95 out of 100, were photographs from the past, not the present. So it's not just the American public that struggles to know, what tribes are, what federally recognized tribes are, what tribal sovereignty is, what Indigenous rights are, what contemporary Indigenous people truly are. It's also the leaders of our country. And so to demonstrate that, I'm going to share this video of George W. Bush.
Good morning. My name is Mark Trahant. I'm the editorial page editor of the Seattle Post-Intelligencer and a member of the Native American Journalists Association. Most school kids learn about government in the context of city, county, state, and federal. And of course, tribal governments are not part of that at all. Mr. President, you've been a governor and a president, so you have a unique experience looking at it from 2 directions. What do you think tribal sovereignty means in the 21st century, and how do we resolve conflicts between tribes and the federal and state governments?
Yeah. Tribal sovereignty means that it's sovereign. I mean, you've been given sovereignty, and you're viewed as a sovereign entity.
Okay.
And therefore, the relationship between the federal government and tribes is one between sovereign entities.
Oops. So we can laugh at George W. Bush, but how many of you can explain what a federally recognized tribe is? How many can you name 3 federally recognized tribe? In the categories of Navajo and Cherokee aren't a federally recognized tribe, Cherokee Nation or Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians or the United Kituwa Band. Those are the names of federally recognized tribes. How many folks on here know what the Indian Reorganization Act did, or what the policy of land allotment was? Or how many of you can name any federal law that has impacted tribes in the United States? How many folks know what the Oliphant Supreme Court decision was, or could name any important court decision in the history of the United States that impacted Native rights? And so the type of ignorance that, we can laugh at in that Bush video is actually pervasive among American citizens. So this is the Google predictive search of results for do Native. So it's like what people Google most often. And it's, do Native Americans pay taxes? Yes, we do. Do Native Americans get free money? No, we don't. And do we celebrate Thanksgiving? And so I believe strongly as a journalist, that the stories that we tell ourselves about who we are as a country, where we come from, really impact laws and policy that in turn impact people's lives. And so that's why it's important for people to understand what tribal sovereignty is, because as long as we have a public and a voting citizenry that doesn't know what tribal sovereignty is, it means that our congressional representatives, Our federal judges, the people that we elect and put into power aren't going to be asked or expected to know what tribal sovereignty is anyways. One of the last big court cases that went to the Supreme Court is called Adoptive Couple v. Baby Girl. And in it, there's a section where the Supreme Court justices, sitting Supreme Court justices, debate what constitutes a federally recognized tribe. These are the people who have the power to determine what rights our tribes have, and they don't even understand legally what it is. So let's get into it. What is tribal sovereignty? So I think the most important thing to remember about tribal sovereignty is that it is not something that is given to tribes. It is inherent. Our native nations predate the creation of the United States. And while US colonialism and US law has obviously dramatically impacted our rights to self-determination and to self-governance, and to things like our land and our culture and our water and our resources, even though those rights have been impacted, they are inherent. So they're not something that is given to Native nations by the United States. They are something that we have had, we automatically have, because we have existed as Native nations since time immemorial. And the bedrock of the legal relationship between the US federal government and Native nations is the over 300 treaties that the US federal government has signed with Native nations through the exact same constitutional process that the US has signed treaties with Japan or Germany or other foreign governments. And so while we're in a tricky place where, we've been defined as domestic dependent nations and we have a trust relationship to the United States, the bedrock of that is the treaty clause of the US Constitution and that nation to nation relationship between the US federal government and our Native nations. And so I think one of the other really important concepts when it comes to tribal sovereignty is that we are a political group, and that's how our rights function, and that's how the law works. So just like I have certain rights because I live in Oklahoma, or I live in Cherokee County, or I'm a citizen of the United States, and all that impacts what local and federal laws apply to me and which ones don't, because I am a citizen of Cherokee Nation, certain laws apply to me, and through the government of my tribe and that government's relationship to the US, certain laws flow to me. And so it's the same thing as we would think about with any other country or any other system of government. And it's really important thing for people to understand. And I think one thing too that is really misunderstood is that people, just like those Google search results or the Google image search results, people have very, very outdated ideas about what tribal governments look like. So many of our tribal governments look very similar to state or federal governments. Our tribal governments have our own laws, we have our own citizens, we have our own constitutions, we have our own court systems, our lands, police forces, healthcare systems. In a lot of places, I can say as somebody who lives in Eastern Oklahoma, in rural Oklahoma, a lot of the governmental infrastructure, whether it's paving a road or paying for a school to get a new basketball court or providing healthcare in a rural area, is done here locally by the tribal governments. And so just like we would understand the difference between a city and a county and a state and the federal government and how all those layers of government work together. And in the education system in the United States, we teach that as kind of a civic lesson and a basic thing that we want, the citizens of our democracy to understand. Tribal governments are an important layer of government when it comes to, healthcare, roads, safety, environmental protection, that people need to understand how that layer of government fits into the broader picture of the United States. We have a nation-to-nation relationship with the US federal government that has been affirmed by the over 370 treaties that the US has signed with Native nations. And while often those treaties aren't still followed and we still have to advocate for those treaties to be followed, they're still the law of the land. And so a lot of times people think that, just like that, search result thing where, the question was, do Native Americans get free money? People think that tribes get, quote unquote, special treatment. But a lot of that special treatment is actually flows from our treaties. And so in exchange for billions of acres of land, the US federal government made certain promises to indigenous nations. And so sometimes in those treaties, it's, the rights to hunt and fish in certain places. Sometimes it's the right to healthcare or education. And so those programs, whether it be IHS or the Bureau of Indian Affairs, those programs aren't free handouts to Native people and tribes. They're in exchange for the land that the US grew and gained a lot of wealth by. And so we have had, if you look at court decisions and Supreme Court cases in the past 50 years, we've had some really, really big setbacks to Native rights. But we're starting to see a lot of progress in Congress, which is exciting. And I just want to talk about one of those examples, which is the reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act in 2013. And actually the most recent one in 2022, which actually goes into effect this month in October. And so because of a Supreme Court decision in 1978, tribes actually do not have jurisdiction to prosecute non-Native people who commit crimes on their land against their citizens. So if you are not a citizen of a federally recognized tribe, you can go onto tribal land and you can speed, you can steal a pack of gum, you can murder somebody, and the tribe is prohibited from prosecuting you. What has come from that has been a crisis of violence in Indian country. And through that advocacy, really decades-long advocacy of Native women and other tribal leaders, there's been a partial reversal where Congress has has partially rolled back the damage that Oliphant did. And I think that what the research has shown is that where tribes can govern and be in charge of their own citizen safety, of our own land, that increases safety for everyone. So a lot of the issues that we see in Indian country, what we advocate for as solutions to those problems is simply tribal sovereignty and the right to self-determination over our citizens and our land. Thank you so much for coming to this talk and listening to what I have to say. I think when it comes to K through 12 education in the United States, we see a lot of the same problems with what's in the curriculum that are everything I talked about in my talk. So for example, when it comes to the boarding school era in the United States, only 4 states in the US teach boarding schools as part of the state standards curriculum. And in the other states, it's just completely left out. And so there are a lot of examples like that in K through 12 education where Native people are also erased, especially post 1900. Oftentimes we just kind of fall off the map when it comes to history. And so as educators, as people who are in the classroom, you have the power to be an antidote to that, to change that and to change how you teach. So I just would really encourage you to do that and to be the educator from which your students can learn a more complete and a more true history of this country. So thank you again. So honored to talk to you all today. Really appreciate your time.